everyone, welcome to the Creek. My name is Jared Miller. I'm the ministry lead here, and I'm joined today by Andrew Campbell from Truro, Nova Scotia. Andrew, why don't you introduce yourself to the people here at the Creek?
Sure. So my name is Andrew Campbell. I'm the minister at St. James Presbyterian Church here in Truro, and it's great to join you guys.
Well, really glad that you're here. Like the conversation that we're having today is a little bit of a tougher one because we're talking about grief and we're talking about loss and we're talking about some of the realities. For those of you that don't know, Truro was sort of the seat of the worst mass shooting in Canadian history. And at least two of the victims of that shooting were involved or were connected to the congregation of St. James. And so I've invited Andrew to come and have a chat with us about the sort of the realities of grief, to talk about the realities of grief in a COVID season, but also to talk about what it's like to be a community who is distant but still trying to kind of live together in this season. So Andrew, maybe let's just start off and think about that time and that season. What was it like to be so front and center as a community? What's it like to be surrounded by the kind of fear and anxiety, and to know that there's something like this happening just outside your door? Truro's not I grew up in Truro. It's not it's not a big city by any stretch, and so to know that something like this is happening minutes away from people that you know, what was it like to be a minister and to be pastorally sensitive and responsible for people with all the unknown and all the fear and with everything that was going on?
Sure. Yeah, it was. I can think back to it, and I can remember the Sunday quite well. And of course, Sunday morning when I woke up, I wasn't actually all that aware of what was going on because I was very focused on getting stuff ready for worship. So our worship happens virtually through live streaming, and so I was focused on some of the technical parts of it, but also just being prepared myself. So I was a little oblivious to what was going on when we actually went live. And of course, there was the chat part where many of members of our congregation do connect with one another and welcome each other and say good morning and all those wonderful things. And people were saying kind of about what was happening. And so immediately following our service of worship, I flipped up my phone and did what most people do in our generation and started looking through and trying to figure out, okay, what is going on and what is exactly taking place. And just, by that point, it was sort of in the middle of the actual whole event. By that point, they still were unsure where he was and if he was traveling, that he had escaped sort of the containment zone. There was a lot of anxiety around he's probably coming towards Truro. We kind of, it was just a real crazy kind of moment. And then the other part was knowing that there was people who were both in that area with Portapique, which is sort of where it began, the area of Portapique, but also Debert and some of the surrounding communities as well. And so I was able to make some connections with some folks. And actually that was when I actually started trying to call to the two members of our congregation to get in touch with them. And both of their phones were going directly to voicemail. And that was kind of a sinking feeling. And so that was kind of a long day that I had spent trying to connect with other folks, sending emails and phone calls, and kind of knowing that much of the region was on lockdown, and trying to kind of find out, did you talk to John and Joanne? Does anybody know anything? And then come to find out that they were probably most likely two of the first victims. So actually from the night before. And so, yeah, it was a long day. And then it turned into a long week. And certainly pastorally, it was very different in that knowing, not just the COVID stuff, but, you can't be there and trying to connect with people and see if they're safe. And then people were asking me and getting in touch with me in different ways to know if I knew anything, and then not wanting to say anything, kind of as a, I didn't want to upset others to say, I don't know anything and I think something terrible has happened, and kind of went, well, I've left a message and hopefully we'll hear from them. You try to put on that sort of that braver face, that sort of good front. And meanwhile, trying not to have a panic attack every time you hung up the phone, or when the phone rang, to look and see, okay, who is it? And is it, what number's coming up, and that kind of stuff. So it's, there was certainly a lot there, just personally to process. And then, as that day went along, and I was in touch with some family as well of John and Joanne's, and as it became more and more apparent that no one had been able to get in touch with them, and that the RCMP couldn't confirm anything, but they also couldn't tell us, because there was some evacuation sites, and there was people who had been shuttled different places and moved to try and protect them. And so it was sort of a question of, well, maybe they were part of one of these evacuation zones, when all things got sorted out. But anyways, it certainly was hard in that way. And for myself, and I'm sure everyone else involved in different ways, and anyone who had been involved in a greater way, part of those evacuation zones, or things I can only begin to imagine what they were feeling and going through. And we had other congregants who had said, they had, RCMP knock on their door and were told to, bunker in their basement during our worship service, and things like that. So, we were able to check up with them. They were okay, obviously, which was great. That was good news. But it was, it made it certainly. It was, I know a lot of people used it, and truthfully, I hate the word because it got so overused, but I don't know a better word, but that's sort of surreal. Like, it almost doesn't feel like it's actually reality.
Absolutely.
Was absolutely a part of it.
Yeah. So how long was it from the time that, you made that first call to the family, and how long did you guys have to sit with that sort of that unknown quantity question? Like, how long was it from the time that you first made that call to when you got some degree of confirmation?
It really wasn't even until the next morning that we got a little more confirmation. So by that point, we were into Monday, and actually it wasn't even what we were told at that point was that they couldn't confirm anything, but that they needed to track down next of kin to do some DNA testing. And then that would actually take more than a week to actually have what the RCMP would call official confirmation. But by that point, as much as they couldn't, legally officially confirm it, in our heart of hearts, we knew, but that was kind of, we were looking at well into a 36 hour kind of uncertainty. But, with every hour that went by, you were more aware that the news that I'm going to get on the phone is not going to be good news. So certainly harder. I think there was a bit of actually relief to have it confirmed, oddly enough, because that's always part of that wondering too. But so it was probably well over 24 into 36 hours, kind of still wondering, but yeah.
So this happened, like, our world, kind of from this is a broad generalization, but our world is not great at acknowledging hardships. Like, one of the things that we do in our kind of social media world is we curate an approach to life that eliminates all of the hardships, and we create this sort of cultural norm that nothing bad happens. We share the good and bury the bad. And I think it's fair to say that culturally we've sort of lost our the normative reality of grief. What would you say, as somebody who has sort of walked through that shattering of reality for people, that, hey, this can happen here. This is a small town where, I mean, generally people feel pretty safe in Truro. I mean, it's not everyone leaves their doors unlocked kind of community, but it's not a far stretch from that.
No.
And so thinking about the sort of the shattering of that reality, would you say are some of the pitfalls that we can try to avoid as we think about other places in the world where we're trying to hide that grief away, where we're trying to kind of avoid it or hope it doesn't affect us? What have you found any kind of ways that would better prepare other people or yourself for grief the next time it happens? What are some ways that you found helpful to kind of guard your heart against being unprepared for grief in the future?
Sure. And I think, I mean, there's a lot of ways to pull that question apart. I think for me, one of them, I don't know if it's a guarding of my heart as much as I think, because I think that's so often what we try to do. We try to have such a strong defense. Grief's not even going to get in. We're not even going to let it in. And then when something like this happens, or just something like COVID happens, we find ourselves grieving. And I think it's less about guarding. I think it's more about having the right tools to be able to walk through it and process through it, which I think is one of the big pitfalls. I think we're so focused on trying to guard against it that when it shows up at the doorstep, we have no idea. We weren't prepared to do this at that point, right? I think one of the pitfalls is just, what is language that we can use around grieving? And certainly there's some language that's familiar, and I think it's, some of it is just people who come and say, I'm so sorry that this has happened, or there's sort of a surface level to that. But I think when we start to go deeper, and I think to me especially, that's where faith steps in. For me, I've always been a fan of Psalms. Psalms have always been a part of my life, and I think part of our tradition as Presbyterians, the Reformed tradition, we keep Psalms front and center, kind of thing, all the time. But I found myself kind of doubly thankful and spending more time than I was with Psalms and with lament, with Lamentations, from Scripture, and just how that actually gives language to grieve and what to, what to do and where to put that grief. And so one of my favorite Psalms, oddly enough, for most people, it's a psalm that sort of has it's kind of an existential crisis if you're not super familiar with them. Anyways, I think it's 136, but it's the psalm that begins with, as I weep along the shores of Babylon. And it very much comes out of a time of grieving and mourning. Sure. The world has been flipped upside down for God's people, and they've been taken into slavery and exile. And the ending of the psalm, and so I hope I'm not spoiling people, and I hope I'm not turning them off either.
For the Psalms.
Yeah. So if you've never read through the psalm, and the lectionary actually cuts the psalm off. Which I think is, one of the worst parts of it. It trims the psalm and makes it kind of nice and ready and presentable. But if you get right to the end of it, what the psalm says is, blessed are those who, again, spoiler, and if you have a queasy stomach, I'm sorry. Blessed are those who bash the heads of the Babylonian babies upon the rocks. Which, when you first read that, your eyes are like, what is this? How is this in God's word? So you have to start kind of, okay, what does this mean? Well, when you actually step a little back from the psalm and you realize this is a grieving, hurting people who've been conquered, who've seen their own children dashed, literally, and killed, who have been taken into slavery and exile, who are grieving all that they knew and all that their hopes and dreams, and they're living in this reality. And what are they doing with it? They are bringing it to God in song and in psalm and prayer. And to me, as much as I don't necessarily believe that that's meant to be in 2020 a blessing of go and do this, as much as it is, I think it's a blessing of we are meant to take our deepest, that darkest part of our grief and mourning, the part that we think I needed to be guarded against this and no one can know, and to hand that to God and say, I don't know what to do with this. I can't. You know what I mean? In who I am and in my sinful nature, this is where I'm going, and I need redemption. And so I think that's where, the Psalms of Lament. I think that's where Scripture. I think that's where grief and mourning meets faith, and they're meant to go hand in hand. the beloved psalm that most people know, that, as a minister of almost every funeral, if not every second funeral, someone asks, can we read Psalm 23?
Yeah,
sure. I mean, it's a great psalm, but it's never the promise of you're not going to end up in the valley that is dark and full of death, that is lacking life, the valley of the shadow of death. It's that God will be there with you through it.
Right.
And I think for a lot of people, whether it was COVID or here with this the tragedy of this mass shooting, or I think just most of us in life, I mean, whether we want to admit it or not, at some point we all grieve. You can't love without grief, because in order to love something, you have to hold it that tightly and that closely, and it means that much, and especially when it comes to people and relationships. But at the same time, we also know that we have loved ones who do pass from this world.
Absolutely.
And so we grieve them, and that's part of that language. And so I think the big, to me, one of the big pitfalls, the two big pitfalls, I think, are, one is just not having a language that lets us grieve and lets us say those things that our heart is rumbling about, because we think like, God is going to smite me if he knew. And it's like, well, no, God's pretty aware of humanity and what we're capable of. Look what happened to Jesus, and yet he meets us with love, and he meets us with that unshaking faithfulness, not because we've earned it, but because of who God is. And so, that's the place that we take that. I think so. I think that's one of the pitfalls. The other one, I think, is that grief, we often treat it like it should be like any other kind of disease. Oh, I hurt my ankle. I was playing soccer. I twisted my ankle. 2 weeks, right? I should be back up and fine. This past winter, I, through a series of kind of one of those crazy events, I ended up breaking 2 of my ribs. I was sledding with my daughter, and anyway, it was one of those things. We got to the bottom of the big hill. You're probably familiar with it, the big hill on Bible Hill.
Oh no, not the Legion Hill.
Not the Legion Hill. No.
Yeah.
Well, my daughter she's only 4, so. But anyways, we got to the bottom, but a bunch of the other kids had made a bit of a ramp, and so her and I went up in the air. Kind of realized I shouldn't land on her, so I grabbed her and rolled. But of course, just the way I sort of landed, as soon as I landed, there was that good popping sound. Anyways, that was whatever, and that was but I kind of knew at the end of it, probably 6-8 weeks, I'll be fine. I've been able to go golfing here a little bit since things have opened up. It hasn't been bothering me. I knew it would heal. So often with grief, we wanted the healing to be on time. So whether it's 2 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever it is, as long as we know, okay, this is the window here, this is your grieving time. And when you're done, you'll be all better. You can go and do the other things. And grief doesn't work that way. It doesn't follow time. And so I think so often one of the pitfalls is, well, that happened, a month ago, or somebody who even now could be saying, I'm really struggling with this COVID stuff. And someone's going, it's been 3 months. Haven't you got it figured out? Well, no. I mean, especially for somebody who perhaps is 40, 50, 60, they're having to unlearn, a whole lifetime of life and expectations and things and how things should work in 2 or 3 months. And so how to grieve through that. I think we often stick that time part on it, and it just doesn't work that way. Which I think early on in one of my sermons, actually, during all this COVID thing, we were actually talking about the old not greeting, but sort of dismissal, but sort of saying goodbye to someone in the way of saying Godspeed, which often was sort of that whole idea of, go and, make, Godspeed as you go kind of thing. And often we think that means I'm going to go as fast as I can, as efficiently as I can, as smooth as I can. And yet if you look at scripture, most people who travel and go with God, who are walking with God, going back to Psalm 23, or walking with God, in especially in those darker places, fast, smooth, and efficient are not part of what God offers to us. Presence, absolutely, unshakable, unshakableness is part of who God is. But most efficient, according to 2020 Western society, not really. And so I think one of the pitfalls is we expect grieving to be fast, smooth, and efficient. And it's not. It's shaky, it's bumpy, it's fits and starts, it's back and forth. For us, I know that was one of the hardest parts for us as a congregation, and just I think Truro and this part of the world was we were just starting to figure out, okay, how can we get some footing with all that was taking place in COVID? And then this, one of the worst tragedies in our country took place. And so then you're trying to, okay, how do I get footing now? And then, 2 weeks later, it would just be something else. And it was sort of, kind of that whole, it was almost like the, wounds by 1,000 cuts. Mm-hmm. And certainly these were deeper than that, but it was, it was, one thing on top of another. How do I deal with all that? How do I unpack all that? And, I think most people now are starting to get through that. I've seen some people who kind of are, they believe grieving should have been fast, smooth, and efficient. So they're just done with it. That was a few months ago. It was horrible and it was bad, and we won't talk about it anymore. Which I think is also part of that. That's that shield.
The maritime way.
Well, it was funny. The week during the shooting. So by Wednesday, it was, like I said, it was a long 36 hours, but it was a long week because there was a lot of conversations with family who were not present here in Nova Scotia, especially for John and Joanne. And they couldn't be here because of all the other things. Under normal circumstances, they'd have been gathered together with us. We'd have been able to see them and give them a hug and, be there present that way. And so instead we did a lot of that through the phone. But by Wednesday, I was just kind of tired and drained, and so was my wife even. And I remember just saying, let's just get Thai, or let's get takeout for supper and not have to worry about, cooking and some of those parts. So I said, I'll go pick up Thai food from our favorite Thai restaurant here. And anyways, I ended up spending over a half hour at the Thai restaurant trying to pick up my food, because I ended up into a pastoral conversation with the guy who owns the Thai restaurant and the guy who owns the brewery and grow shop that's next door, which, location. But anyways, because they were both there and they were trying to process this. And, when they found out I was a minister, it just kind of came up, and we were talking about, because they knew people, and that was part of the reality too. Everybody knew somebody who had been one of the victims in some way. And sometimes that's the best part of maritime life and maritime culture and Truro and that whole, everybody knows everybody kind of thing. But when tragedy strikes, everybody, the whole web and network feels the weight of it. And so, we ended up talking about, life and purpose and, how could all this happen? And, certainly they were trying to get to some of the theodicy questions. They weren't coming right out with it. I mean, again, like I showed up in flip-flops and a polo. I wanted pads CU and to go home. Like that was not what I was there for. But we got into it and a little bit. And for me, it was certainly just to say, sometimes I think, asking the questions of how did this happen? Not that they're not important, but we can get so caught up in that we forget to ask the questions, how are we going to heal through this? Mm-hmm. And how are we going to get to a place that we can make sure that the wounds that have been created from these things don't become deeper wounds that create more? Which I think is, again, it goes back to that healing kind of thing that I tried to start all this rant with, that we want the healing for grief, to be fast and smooth and efficient. And usually when we try to do that, all we end up doing is leaving it half healed. And it just festers and usually creates more wounds that need more healing. So
that question of how is such a really poignant question, because it's not one that we ask a lot. We ask the when questions, and we ask the if. And we're I think more comfortable as people sort of asking, if I get through this grief, or when I get through this grief. But that I think that how question is such a poignant question, because it it asks a lot of other questions. It brings a lot of other questions along with it, sort of as, it's kind of like a Trojan horse question, because as soon as you start to ask the how question, you can get into some of those bigger questions about we have in Christianity, we're blessed to have a tradition that has 2,000 years of grief. That we have grief as kind of our central story. On the cross, God doubts God. Jesus shouts out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Yeah. On his cross. And so our faith kind of, carries us through that. We take that how piece for granted. But for a lot of our neighbors who don't have a faith tradition to fall back on, that piece about trying to understand how do we move through grief, not thinking about it in terms of when, like you said, or not thinking even in terms of if, like it's moving through, it's a possibility, but asking those sort of practical guidance questions. I mean, it requires a level of vulnerability that I'm not sure. I'm not sure I would want to expose myself to if I didn't have to. But the realities of grief kind of beg the question, like, how am I going to get through this? How am I going to get out of bed tomorrow and put one foot in front of the other when it feels like my world has been turned upside down? And I think those are really, those are really, I think, powerful questions to ask, because in a season like this one, where in COVID, everybody has had to grieve something. You alluded to this a little bit a second ago, so I just want to pick up some of those threads. Sure. Like everybody has lost something. There have been kids who've been born without their grandparents being able to come and hold them. There have been birthdays that have been missed, and there have been jobs that have been lost, and there have been celebrations that have been truncated and retirements that have been early. There have been just trips that have been canceled, and the loss of the loss of life in and of itself is its own grief point. There have been so many things in our communities and in our neighborhoods that we've sort of been forced into acknowledging grief and sort of living with this reality that, okay, the plans I made are worth the paper maybe that they're printed on. But so for a world, for a country that's already kind of trying to deal with grief, and for people who are already sort of living in this space of grief, what would you say were your biggest takeaways when it came to your dealing with it? Like, how has this made you a better neighbor and a better friend and a better pastor? Like, how have you been able to sort of deal with new grief as it's happened? Because it's been a couple months now since then, or when? What was the date? April? No.
April 26th.
Yeah. So it's been.
I'd have to look to double check, but yeah, it's been a couple of months.
Yeah. So how has this made you a better neighbor? How has this changed the reality that you approach grief with as a like you mentioned, the pastoral conversation that you sort of stumbled into at the Thai restaurant? Has this shaped the way you have those conversations?
I think as a pastor, I don't know if it's shaped the way I have the conversations. I think it's that for a lot of people in our country, and in our communities, and I'm going to steal a bit of a page out of Ross Lockhart's book on this, is that most of our neighbors fall into that category of sort of affable agnostic. There's sort of a general sense of God as something or someone or somewhere, and God's good? Question mark. Like, it's sort of it's not a direct I'm opposed to God. It's just every day, God really doesn't mean a whole lot to me. Every now and again, it might pop up a little bit. And I think during these times, I think that door got open more.
Okay.
That people were all of a sudden having to actually wrestle with those big questions, those existential questions. who am I and what is life about? If life was before about, as the wonderful lady sung, working for the weekend kind of thing. Well, all of a sudden, your weekend was sitting at home with people that maybe you didn't really know all that well. If life was about, climbing that corporate ladder, all of a sudden, all of the ladder, most corporate ladders got halted pretty quickly. And for a lot of companies, as you said, too, in places, a lot of the rungs fell off as well. So, so there was a lot of questions, I think, around that. But I think there's even just the general questions of, well, if I got sick, right? Which I think, especially for people our age who are, younger and, who aren't really dealing with those questions, who are trying to raise kids and those questions, are looking at that side of life as opposed to towards the end of life. All of a sudden, I think end of life questions came for a lot of people, and not just those who are 75 and over or 80 and over kind of thing. So I think all of a sudden, Christianity and our faith has taught us how to have some of those conversations, and certainly, Scripture has a lot more to say on those conversations about what is life about, and who are we, and whose are we. But I think for a lot of folks, all of a sudden, they were more willing to have those conversations than they might have been before. Which I think is also, to take the pastoral hat on and put the evangelist hat on for a quick sec. I think that's where, as Christians, we do have a bit of that responsibility to know our own faith and our own story, and to actually be able to put it into words. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be a Billy Graham. That's a whole different kind of thing. But I think just being able to say, this is how I got through it, and here's what I think, and here's what Scripture teaches me about it, or why I do some of the things that I do, and why it's important to me. I think those are questions that all of us can answer, and that we can all put into our own words. So I think this whole situation has, pastorally kind of opened some of those doors for both myself, and I think some conversations I've had with others. They've been surprised at how all of a sudden their neighbors were, a little more receptive to that. How have I been a better neighbor? I think in some ways just in the area that we live, because all of us were sort of trapped in that area, especially in the earlier parts of all of this. Now things are starting to open up. It's kind of reverting a little bit back to more normal. But I think at that time, those were some of the only human interactions that a lot of us were having in person. Certainly, we were having these Zoom interactions and things, and they have been good. But let's be honest, there is something that kind of, it doesn't quite have that something. It lacks a little bit, and I can admit that, and I think everyone else can understand that. So I think being a neighbor that way, it was just sort of, you were a little more hyper aware of the people who actually lived close to you. And so I think all of a sudden, we were spending a lot more time doing gardening and yard work and things that just needed to be done around our house that we were neglecting because we have 2 kids at home. And it was like, that's not important. We don't have time. And all of a sudden we had a bunch of time, and we're looking at these things every day going, oh, that's ugly. We need to fix that tree that's been dead for 2 years. We should actually cut it down and do something with it as opposed to just leaving it there. I think as well, it's also, just had more of a chance to, have some of those conversations, like, talking with neighbors of ours, who, during some of these things, with the shootings of, some of the ones that they knew, who were the people that they were mourning and grieving and thing, through all of this. How are they getting along with, because their kids don't live here. Their kids are away in university, or they live in Toronto and they have their own families, and just, some of those conversations. I was surprised as well, just by kind of happenstance. And for one of the services, I was getting kind of prepared and ready. And it was one of these kind of nicer days back in May. And my kids wanted to be outside, and I needed to actually practice a little bit of playing guitar. Otherwise, it was going to be worse than it was going to be on Sunday morning. So I took my guitar and went outside, and I was just kind of singing in the backyard, so I could keep a half an eye on my children, at least appear to be a good father, if nothing else. and kind of picking around and playing kind of over on on the grass or whatever, and all of a sudden like a bunch of our neighbors kind of like came and joined in and wanted to see what this was about, and so we ended up kind of into like a half weird kind of worship service on a Saturday evening at 6:00.
Wow.
While my children were trying to half kill each other with taco trucks, but that was life. And so it was sort of, it also invited, I think, some questions around, well, what is church? What is ministry? And what is faith? And what is life? So for me, there was even questions as a pastor of, okay, what is it the role that I've been called into? What does that even, how has that changed? And how has that actually, ultimately, how has that furthered the kingdom? Which I think is the bigger part of what, yourself and I think, others as well are certainly called, I think, as Christians, that we're called to be a part of. And that work of what does kingdom work look like, now, and what will it look like? And maybe it's going to look a lot more like, backyard kitchen parties that turn into a moment for the gospel.
So has, in a more, this is one of the questions that I sent you, but has this kind of interaction and the way it's like the openness that people have kind of expressed, has it changed the way that you sort of think about like structuring a service? Like I mean, we can talk about the way the way COVID and the way the realities of grief as we kind of experience them today kind of force us to rethink the way, like the old liturgy of a funeral is very much a Christendom liturgy. And the way a funeral is kind of structured is been largely unchanged for most of the Reformation history. Has this kind of openness and these experiences of neighborhood kind of interaction and involvement, and really, I mean, what we're talking about here is essentially neighborhood evangelism, but has this kind of interaction shaped the way that you think about the way we structure church, the way we structure our programs, the way we structure our worship, the way we structure these things? Has there been any kind of reflection that you've been able to do around that?
Sure. My, for my confession time, personally, I'm more of an introverted personality. So reflection is secondary nature, and it's usually that I have to be pulled out of the reflection, be like, no, we got to do something. It's not just sit and reflect and have all the good ideas. They don't mean anything. And if they're just written on paper, kind of thing. They need to find life in the world. And so I've done a lot of reflecting on it. And but I think how has that played out? And certainly I think some of the things that I've taken away from it, or I think that I've learned from it, and that I'm interested in seeing how will that then play out further in the life of the church going forward. One, I think, is, and again, this is not my idea, but certainly one that I've been picking up on. One I think we're seeing more and more and more of now is that we've asked too much of 1 hour on a Sunday morning. Because we've wanted it to be mission, we wanted it to be evangelism, we want it to be discipleship, we want it to be worship, we want it to do all the things for the whole week, right? So we can check it off and say, I did the church thing and now I'm set. And I think the reality is, one of the COVID lessons I think that I've learned, and I think others are learning as well, is that Sunday morning worshiping is not all of that. It's certainly parts of that. And certainly shades of that show up, but it's not, the whole mission of the church isn't, for 1 hour on Sunday morning. Right. Very much, and certainly scripturally it speaks to this, that we are the gathered and sent people. And, I think Christendom got very good at focusing on the gathering. I think the Christendom, or the post-Christendom part of the post-COVID part, is going to be that we got to be a better sent people. So what does it mean to actually live this out in everyday life? I think the discipleship part as well, that, especially as we're looking at, a post-COVID kind of time of gathering, and what will that look like? And certainly time is going to be a part of it. How much time, are people going to be willing to even be gathered with others? I think it's certainly a question that we've been asking. I'm sure others are all asking that in different ways. My expectation is that, we're going to be probably less than the hour, which usually, for better or for worse, most people who join at St. James usually are aware that I'm much closer, probably an hour and 15, hour and a half hour kind of range than I am, strict to an hour thing. Sometimes I just get caught up in what we're doing. Sometimes I have a little bit more that I feel like I want to say, and certainly, we have a lot that takes place at our services of worship usually, because part of it as well, we're a very musical church in many ways. And so that's going to be an interesting part for us to try and figure out, how do we keep in those traditions and that part alive, and yet in a reality where perhaps, choral singing, which I think we have at least 2-3 choral or groups that would sing together, plus smaller quartets and things that are a part of our regular life. And then not to mention, sometimes just special music by a soloist or a duet or those kind of things. So how are we going to, and certainly some of that's absolutely going to exist, but it's definitely going to have to, it's going to need to shift some. So there's those parts to it. But I think too, it's recognizing that the gathering is about, it's about that worship, and it's about, lifting high the name of Christ, and to place our hurts and cares and sorrows and joys at his feet, but then also to be sent. And so I think that's been part of the lesson of the reflection that I've been kind of playing with. And again, I think it's as much about how is this going to, keep playing out over time. And I think, the church, I think the church has been changed. I think the church has been needing to be changed. I think we've hung on to the Christendom part far longer than maybe we should have or we're supposed to. But of course, like most of our lives, it takes a bit of crisis to really force change, right? And so the idea of crisis being a catalyst, I think in some ways we're going to continue to see that this crisis has been a catalyst for reimagining or revisioning what church is and can be, and what does a life of faith that is lived out look like.
That's awesome. I think that's a great note to end on. What a hopeful, perfect summary of sort of everything. Thank you so much, Andrew, for being here to chat with us today.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been, I've enjoyed it. It's been good.
I'm so glad. Andrew, do you have anything that you want to plug? How do people get in touch with you if they want to ask any follow-up questions?
Sure. So if you're wanting to get in touch with me, probably right now, funny enough, we're trying to figure out how new things are going to be with our own services. So we're in the middle of doing all those changes, like emails and stuff. But if you wanted to go and to shoot me an email, you can send me one at rev.agcampbell at Gmail. You can check us out at stjamestruro.org as well as our website. Or you can search St. James Church through YouTube, and our YouTube channel and stuff like that should come up there as well. Realizing there's a lot of St. James's on YouTube. So
we'll put all the links down in the description at the bottom of the video. Yeah. But awesome. Thank you so much for sharing this wisdom with us, Andrew. We're grateful for your ministry, and we're grateful that you're there to be a faithful presence in an awful time. And I know we have a lot of people, even here in Calgary, who are still connected to the Maritimes, and they're still feeling the reality of all this. And so I think we'll appreciate the wisdom that you've been able to bring and share, and just thank you so much for taking the time to share it with us.
Thank you for the invitation and for organizing this, and for being that blessing to the kingdom where you are, and may God continue to bless you. Thank you.
Likewise. Anyway, for now, for everybody who's watching, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. All the best. Cheers.